That was a sort of magical time in my life doing that. I mean, it's like a dream when you're there. It's those incredible beaches, that incredible life.
Few television shows have managed to stay fresh while replacing their main character again and again. Most long-running detective dramas depend on one iconic investigator. Once that character leaves, the audience often loses interest, ratings fall, and the series quietly disappears. Yet Death in Paradise has somehow turned constant change into its greatest strength. Every few years, another detective arrives on the fictional Caribbean island of Saint Marie, solves impossible murders beneath swaying palm trees, slowly adapts to island life, and eventually leaves. Instead of damaging the show, those departures have become part of its identity. At first glance, Saint Marie seems like the perfect place to work. Crystal clear water, warm sunshine, colorful villages, friendly locals, and beautiful beaches create the appearance of a permanent vacation. Every episode follows a familiar formula. A mysterious murder occurs, clues seem impossible to connect, suspects hide secrets, and eventually the detective gathers everyone together for one final explanation that reveals the killer. It is one of television's most comforting routines, and fans return year after year because they know exactly what kind of experience they will receive. But beneath that comforting formula lies something far more interesting. Every detective who steps onto the island arrives carrying emotional baggage. Saint Marie doesn't simply provide crimes to solve. It quietly transforms the people investigating them. By the time each detective truly belongs, their personal journey has reached its natural conclusion. That's why they leave. This pattern began with Detective Inspector Richard Poole. When audiences first met him, he seemed completely unsuited to Caribbean life. He wore heavy suits despite the tropical heat, disliked the beaches, complained about the weather, struggled with local customs, and preferred strict order over relaxed island living. Almost everything about Saint Marie irritated him. While everyone around him embraced the slower pace of life, Richard stubbornly clung to his British routines. Yet Richard possessed one extraordinary talent. Behind his awkward personality and constant discomfort was a brilliant analytical mind. He noticed tiny details everyone else ignored and could untangle the most confusing murder cases through pure logic. That combination made him fascinating to watch. He wasn't charming because he fit into the island. He was charming because he refused to. Over time, something unexpected happened. Richard slowly changed. He developed genuine friendships with his colleagues, particularly Camille Bordy. He began trusting the people around him and accepted that Saint Marie had its own rhythm and way of doing things. He never transformed into someone who loved beaches or tropical weather, but viewers could clearly see his emotional walls beginning to crumble. Behind the scenes, however, actor Ben Miller faced a difficult reality. Although the show looked like paradise on television, filming required spending months each year in Guadeloupe, far away from home and family. Long shooting schedules, intense heat, and lengthy separations eventually convinced him that it was time to move on. The producers now faced a major challenge. How could they remove the show's central detective without disappointing audiences? Their solution shocked everyone. Rather than transferring Richard back to Britain or inventing another convenient excuse, the writers killed him. In the opening episode of Series 3, Richard Poole himself became the murder victim. It was an astonishing creative decision. The detective who had spent 2 seasons solving murders suddenly became the body lying on the ground. For many viewers, it was heartbreaking. Richard had become the face of the series, and losing him felt almost impossible to accept. Yet that bold decision achieved something remarkable. It instantly established that nobody in the show was untouchable. Saint Marie suddenly became more than a picturesque island where mysteries happened every week. It became a place where real consequences existed. Richard's death also gave Death in Paradise permission to reinvent itself. Instead of endlessly comparing future detectives to the original, the writers openly acknowledged that each new lead would bring something different. That willingness to embrace change ultimately became the show's greatest strength. Replacing Richard seemed almost impossible. Fans had grown attached to his dry humor, awkward personality, and brilliant deductive skills. Whoever arrived next would inevitably be compared to him. Then came Humphrey Goodman, From his very first appearance, it was obvious the producers had deliberately chosen someone completely different. Richard was neat, organized, and emotionally distant. Humphrey was messy, absent-minded, endlessly talkative, and surprisingly open about his feelings. Instead of marching confidently into crime scenes, he often stumbled through them looking slightly confused before somehow noticing the clue everyone else had missed. Chris Marshall brought a warmth that contrasted beautifully with Richard's formality. Humphrey wasn't cold or intimidating. He genuinely cared about people. His kindness often encouraged witnesses to reveal information they might never have shared with someone more intimidating. Although his desk remained permanently cluttered and he frequently appeared disorganized, his mind connected details with astonishing speed whenever a murder needed solving. His arrival proved something many fans hadn't believed possible. Death in Paradise could survive without Richard Poole. Humphrey's personal story also differed dramatically from his predecessors. He arrived carrying emotional wounds from a failed marriage and uncertainty about his future. Rather than resisting Sainte Marie, he slowly discovered that the island offered him something he had been missing for years: a genuine sense of belonging. He developed close friendships with the police team, embraced island life far more naturally than Richard ever had, and gradually rebuilt his confidence. His story wasn't about learning to tolerate paradise. It was about rediscovering happiness after personal disappointment. Eventually, however, Humphrey reached a crossroads. The island had healed him, but his future no longer lay there. Instead of forcing the character to remain simply because viewers liked him, the writers allowed him to pursue a new life and a meaningful relationship back in Britain. Unlike Richard's shocking death, Humphrey received a hopeful farewell. His departure demonstrated that not every detective needed tragedy to leave Sainte Marie. Sometimes personal growth naturally leads people toward new opportunities. Even more importantly, Humphrey's exit eventually created an entirely new television series. His story continued in Beyond Paradise, proving that beloved characters could successfully leave Sainte Marie without disappearing forever. That decision expanded the franchise while rewarding loyal viewers who wanted to keep following Humphrey's journey. The next detective to arrive carried an entirely different emotional burden. Jack Mooney appeared friendly, humorous, and instantly approachable. Compared to Richard's stiffness and Humphrey's absent-minded chaos, Jack felt like someone who had already experienced enough hardship to understand life's important priorities. He listened carefully, treated people with kindness, and solved crimes through patience rather than confrontation. But beneath his cheerful personality lay deep grief. Jack was a widower struggling to rebuild his life after losing his wife. Sainte Marie wasn't simply another career assignment. It became a place where he could escape painful memories while slowly learning how to live again. The island provided beautiful surroundings, supportive friends, and meaningful work, but those things could only help him heal for so long. Ardal O'Hanlon brought enormous warmth to the role, making Jack feel less like an outsider and more like someone searching for peace. Unlike Richard, he didn't battle against island life. Unlike Humphrey, he wasn't searching for confidence. Jack was searching for acceptance. His investigations reflected that maturity. Rather than relying solely on clever deductions, he often solved cases by quietly observing human behavior, allowing suspects to reveal themselves through conversation instead of pressure. His compassionate nature became one of his greatest investigative strengths. As the seasons progressed, viewers watched Jack slowly recover from the grief that had defined his arrival. By reconnecting with family and rediscovering hope, he eventually realized that remaining on Sainte Marie could become another form of hiding. Healing required moving forward, not simply staying somewhere that felt safe. His departure, therefore, felt entirely earned. Jack didn't leave because he disliked the island or wanted to escape his responsibilities. He left because the emotional journey that brought him there had finally reached its conclusion. That pattern was becoming increasingly clear. Every detective arrived broken in some way. Every detective slowly healed. And every detective eventually moved on. The island wasn't merely a setting where murders occurred. It was quietly changing every person who lived there. That realization prepared audiences for perhaps the longest and most emotionally complex detective journey the series had ever attempted. Ralph Little's Neville Parker may have been the most unlikely detective ever to arrive on St. Marie. While Richard Poole disliked the island, Neville's body seemed determined to reject it completely. He suffered from countless allergies, worried constantly about germs, disliked insects, struggled with the tropical climate, and found almost every unfamiliar experience intimidating. If there was something to fear, Neville had probably already imagined it. On paper, he seemed like the worst possible choice for a Caribbean detective. Instead, he became one of the show's longest-serving and most beloved leads. Neville arrived at an interesting point in the series' history. By then, audiences already understood the formula. A new detective would appear, solve impossible crimes, slowly adapt to island life, and eventually leave. The danger was that viewers might stop becoming emotionally invested because they expected the cycle to repeat. The writers responded by giving Neville the most gradual transformation the show had ever attempted. Unlike previous detectives, Neville's growth wasn't simply about becoming comfortable on St. Marie. It was about overcoming fears that had shaped his entire life. Every murder investigation forced him into unfamiliar situations. Every friendship challenged his emotional defenses. Every new experience slowly expanded a world that anxiety had kept painfully small. For a long time, Neville talked about leaving. He counted the days until he could return home. Yet almost without realizing it, he built a life on the island. He developed close friendships with his colleagues. He gained confidence in himself. Most importantly, he opened his heart to the possibility of love through Florence Castle. Their relationship wasn't rushed. It developed slowly over several seasons, allowing viewers to witness Neville becoming increasingly brave emotionally. What made his journey so satisfying was its realism. Neville never stopped being awkward. He never became fearless overnight. His anxieties remained part of his personality. The difference was that they no longer controlled every decision he made. Instead of allowing fear to dictate his future, he gradually learned to choose courage despite being afraid. When his time on St. Marie finally came to an end, the decision felt earned rather than forced. Leaving the island with Florence wasn't running away from paradise. It represented the boldest choice Neville had ever made. The man who once feared almost everything finally embraced uncertainty because he believed the future was worth the risk. Behind the scenes, Ralph Little also completed the longest run of any lead detective in the show's history. By the time he departed, he had become deeply associated with the series. Replacing him presented another enormous challenge. Yet by then, Death in Paradise had already trained its audience to expect change. The arrival of Mervin Wilson marked the beginning of another chapter. Unlike previous detectives, Mervin doesn't immediately appear overwhelmed by the island itself. Instead, he seems emotionally guarded and defensive, carrying personal burdens that remain only partly understood. Rather than emphasizing physical discomfort or comic awkwardness, the series focuses on someone reluctant to let others get close. That subtle difference keeps the familiar formula feeling fresh. Each detective has represented a different emotional struggle. Richard embodied rigidity. Humphrey represented personal uncertainty. Jack carried grief. Neville battled anxiety. Mervin appears to be wrestling with emotional resistance, making his story distinct while still fitting the overall pattern that defines the series. Around every new detective stands a supporting cast that provides continuity. Commissioner Selwyn Patterson remains the calm authority guiding each newcomer. Catherine Bordy offers warmth, wisdom, and a place where friendships naturally develop. The officers at the police station give every incoming detective a community they must gradually learn to trust. This balance explains why the series continues succeeding after so many casting changes. The detective changes. The island stays. That consistency allows audiences to welcome new faces without feeling like they're watching a completely different show. Familiar locations, returning characters, and recognizable storytelling rhythms create stability, while each detective introduces fresh emotional dynamics. Of course, there are practical reasons why actors eventually leave. Although the Caribbean setting appears glamorous, filming requires spending months away from family in demanding conditions. Long production schedules, tropical heat, and distance from home eventually become difficult for many performers. Several lead actors have openly explained that family commitments or the desire for new creative opportunities influenced their departures. But practical realities tell only part of the story. Creatively, Death in Paradise depends on change. The central premise works because every detective begins as an outsider. Their unfamiliarity creates comedy, conflict, and emotional growth. As they become fully accepted by the island community, that original tension naturally fades. Keeping them forever would eventually weaken the very formula that made audiences love them. In many television dramas, replacing the main character signals decline. In Death in Paradise, replacement is built into the show's DNA. Each new detective introduces different relationships, different investigative styles, different romantic possibilities, and different personal struggles. The weekly murders remain familiar, but the emotional journey keeps evolving. Perhaps that's because the true star of the series has never been any individual detective. The real main character is Sainte Marie itself. Think about what fans remember most vividly. The colorful police station, Catherine's beachfront bar, the detective's seaside house, the commissioner quietly observing every investigation, the beautiful beaches hiding deadly secrets, the gathering of suspects before the dramatic final explanation. These elements remain regardless of who happens to be leading the investigation. The detective is only a visitor. The island is permanent. That realization also explains why supporting characters matter so much. Throughout the years, viewers have watched beloved figures such as Camille, Dwayne, JP, Florence, Ruby, and others arrive, leave, and sometimes return. Their departures remind audiences that Sainte Marie continues evolving while still preserving its identity. Commissioner Selwyn Patterson perhaps represents this continuity better than anyone else. He has welcomed nearly every detective, watched each one struggle, grow, and eventually move on. In many ways, he serves as the island's memory, connecting every era of the show into one ongoing story. The franchise itself has expanded because of this flexibility. Humphrey Goodman's journey continued in Beyond Paradise, proving that detectives could leave Sainte Marie while remaining interesting elsewhere. The success of that spin-off demonstrated that the emotional formula behind Death in Paradise could work beyond the Caribbean setting. Instead of treating departures as endings, the franchise transformed them into opportunities. That's a remarkably rare achievement in television. After more than a decade, Death in Paradise still balances mystery, humor, romance, and character development without abandoning the cozy atmosphere that attracted viewers in the first place. The murders never become overwhelmingly dark. The comedy never undermines the investigations. The emotional stories enrich the mysteries rather than replacing them. Maintaining that balance season after season is far more difficult than it appears. Every detective leaves behind something valuable. Richard Poole proved the series could survive even its biggest shock. Humphrey Goodman showed that kindness and warmth could define a detective just as effectively as cold logic. Jack Mooney demonstrated that healing from grief could become one of the show's most touching storylines. Neville Parker proved that vulnerability could produce the longest and perhaps most emotionally satisfying character arc the series had ever created. Mervin Wilson now begins writing his own chapter. Every new detective enters carrying the legacy of everyone before them. Fans naturally compare personalities, investigative styles, friendships, romances, and memorable moments. That pressure must be enormous for every actor stepping into the role. Yet, remarkably, each has managed to make the character uniquely their own. Ultimately, the reason every detective leaves Sainte Marie is surprisingly simple. The audience wants the island to remain the same. The story requires the detective to change. That contradiction keeps the series alive. Every detective arrives emotionally incomplete. Through friendships, investigations, love, heartbreak, and personal discovery, the island quietly transforms them into stronger versions of themselves. Once they become whole enough to truly belong, their journey reaches its natural conclusion. Then someone new steps off the plane carrying different fears, different flaws, and different emotional scars. The cycle begins again. Far from being a weakness, That cycle has become Death in Paradise's greatest innovation. Most detective dramas fear losing their leading character. This series has turned those departures into the very reason audiences continue returning year after year. Paradise isn't meant to be where the detectives stay forever. It's where they discover who they were always capable of becoming.